I think we're live. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to SRFC Online, which is being hosted this evening by Angry Robot, which is the name of a publisher. So this evening, I'm talking to Gabriela Houston, a debut novelist who is reading from and talking about her extraordinary new book, The Second Bell, which launches today. Before we get going, a couple of comments. This is a live broadcast, so as ever with live events, please bear with us if anything goes wrong. We've trialed it, we've tested it, we have high hopes, but you never know. Once we finish this evening, a recording of this talk will appear on Facebook and our YouTube channel, where you can also find more than 100 readings and interviews from and with science fiction and fantasy authors. There's a lot to look at, but news things are still going up there. But now, we're going to be hearing a reading from an incredible new book, which is a Slavic folklore-inspired fantasy, but one which uses the mythical creatures in an ingenious way. It builds a perfectly understood and very insightful world around the reactions and realities of wrestling with their existence. And throughout, it's threaded with the decisions and morality of motherhood, as it would apply in such a society. It's an incredible book. People who have been reading it have been full of praise, absolutely rightly, and it launches today, so now you can read it too. Please welcome, reading from her debut novel, The Second Bell, which launches today, Gabriela Houston.
Hello, thank you for this introduction, Magnus. So I'm just going to start at the beginning. Clang. A slender hand hit the table, the iron rings on the fingers ringing out as they touched the wood. There were no words spoken after that. Everyone knew that Myriad had made her decision, and no amount of talking would change it. The women crowded in a small room watched sullenly as Myriad took off her rings and bronze bracelets one by one. She made a point of lifting each item for everyone to see before putting them on a small pile in the middle of the table. You could only take the clothes on your back when you made a choice to go to the Striga's nest. Myriad approached a narrow bed in a corner of the room and picked up a small warm bundle. She pressed it to her chest. A cry came from inside the folds of the fabric, and a woman in a corner spat with disgust. Myriad ignored her and walked past with her head held high. She paused only for a moment, just as her foot was about to pass the threshold. A young man stood outside the door, his hands fidgeting as if he was cold, though he stood in a still warm autumn sun. His dark eyes watched her impassively, and perhaps Myriad was the only one who could notice the furrow on his forehead and a twitch in the corner of his lips. He said nothing, though, and she replied with a silence of her own. Without breaking eye contact, he undid the clasp on his woolen cloak and wrapped it around Myriad's shoulders, his hands pausing for a brief moment as they brushed past her arms. Some of those back in the house muttered disapprovingly. Moments earlier, they'd been family and friends, comforting and coaxing, drawing a vision of a life filled with joy and love. If she would only relent, if she would only let them take her child away. Now they begrudged her even the comfort of a warm cloak. Myriad took a deep breath and stepped out, leaving her life behind. She walked down the road, trying not to look at the people watching her go. Aurek the baker, who had hoped to woo Myriad when she was but a girl, now spat at the sight of her and drew his wife closer to his chest. Gniew, the old shopkeeper who had a soft spot for children and would sometimes give them a chewy sweet or two from the big jar on one of the shop's shelves while their mothers weren't looking, twisted his amiable face and shouted an obscenity that Myriad would never have accused him of knowing. She pulled the cloak closer around her little bundle as the wind blew. A rotten apple flew through the air and splattered in front of her on the stones, its juices spraying the hem of her long skirt. She looked at the crowd. It could have been anyone, any of the women who only a few days ago would spend long hours chatting with her companionably, on the long daily walk bringing the men's lunches to the mine. Any of the men who drank with her husband to celebrate her pregnancy or who patted him on the back after they married. Their faces so familiar and yet now so strange, like a nightmare that puts the face of a dragon on your child's head to frighten and confuse you. This cannot be real. She jutted out her chin with a defiance she didn't feel. As was custom, the whole town had gathered to see her go. $3 came down from mountains in the morning to see the law was obeyed, and they stood now silent at the edge of the crowd. Their ceremonial cloaks had hoods drawn across their faces, so nothing but their unsmiling lips were visible. She was grateful for her presence. They were there for her safety as well. Save the tears for later, she gritted her teeth. Myriad left the town and walked down the muddy path leading towards a forest through the terraced fields. The last of the year's crops had been harvested and the ground looked bare. At the end of the road, just at the edge of the tree line, stood a small hunched-up figure of a woman. Myriad's heart sank, but she walked on. "Are you planning on talking me out of it?" Myriad asked. There was no defiance in her voice, only resignation. "No." The older woman pulled the shawl lower over her forehead. She leaned on her walking stick, which some kind hand had decorated with a crude carving of twirling leaves. White, unseeing eyes turned towards Myriad. "I won't ask you if it's worth it either. Only you can answer that." "It's worth it. It's worth it for me," Myriad said. "Then there is your answer." The woman pulled out a patch from the depths of her apron and proceeded to fill a small pipe. The two stood quietly for a time as she lit it and took the first 2 puffs. She coughed and said quietly, "You could have other babies, though, later." "Yes, but not this one," Myriad said. "No, not this one," the woman replied, her voice making it clear that in her opinion that wouldn't be an altogether bad thing. "You can't come back, you understand." "Good, I don't want to." "Not even if it dies?" The woman brushed the graying hair out of her face. "You're leaving forever, and the forest will never release you." "And what would you have done?" Myriad asked. "If it were you in my place, what would you have done?" The older woman puffed on the pipe, and as she exhaled, a circle of smoke wafted above their heads briefly before dissipating into the air. She nodded. "You'd better be off then." Myriad hesitated and leaned towards the old woman, planting a kiss on her cheek. "Goodbye, Mama." Myriad pulled her child closer to her chest and walked towards the forest, never once looking back.
That was fantastic. Thank you. Gabriela, congratulations on launch day. That's a fantastic book and a fantastic achievement. I was just listening to that. It made me realize how much the opening of the book sets out the agenda for what happens in the whole book. And it gathers and hints some of the themes which are about the sense of protection and sacrifice of motherhood, but also the costs and the decisions that you make, and they're all being imposed upon these societies which take these form because of these creatures that you've kind of extracted, but also created and developed from Polish folklore. Tell us how you came up with this.
So there were several sort of starting points that I kind of put together. So in Strzygas in Polish folklore and sort of Slavic folklore more widely are pretty much straightforward monsters. So they have, 2 hearts, sometimes in some stories, 2 sets of teeth. They can be either cursed humans or humans that were born with 2 hearts and were destined to become monsters. But they were always monsters. There was no nuance to them. They were just bloodthirsty creatures. And I like this idea of sort of exploring, sort of othering others. And I was thinking how, if a child was born with 2 hearts, with some visible difference, or a difference that you could sort of check for in a small community, how would that small community react to it? And history tells us that usually not very well is the answer. So a child like that would presumably have a mother. So what would the mother do? And the answer, I think, is quite complicated. Obviously, as readers, we see the choice that Myriad makes to leave with her child, and we think, oh, that's the right choice. This is, she's a brave woman. She's right, but she wouldn't know that she's right. And that's the really interesting thing for me to explore, because Myriad grew up believing that Strzygas were evil, but they were just, they don't know what powers Strzygas have, and that's sort of half the point. They don't know, but they're scared of it. They know that there's some kind of a power in there. There's some kind of different abilities, perhaps, and they just, because they're different, because they seem to be against nature, they are reviled. And so Myriad grew up with all of this. Strzygas was sort of the ultimate taboo. So obviously, she loves her child, and she doesn't want to abandon her child, but she doesn't know for sure that this child is not really a monster. So she can't know it's the right choice.
to sort of back up a bit and explain what strigas are in your book. I don't think this is what this happens very, very, very early. They're a child born with two hearts. It's identified that the second heart represents a striga heart. And then, like I felt in your book, the striga touched on so many great ideas. So the heart had its own shadow. That shadow was incarnate, and it represented or sort of was a nexus of so many different, very human things, like the passions and their dangers, survivalism and instincts, the connection to nature, the giving and taking of life force, and lots of things. And also very much about self-control and the power of losing self-control. And so one of the things that I thought flowed from that so well is that it was held ambiguous whether as what a society should actually do when it was confronted with people that might do this or might have this feature. So,
like you sort of, explained, the second heart is not the only difference with the strigas. Strigas have a shadow that doesn't seem to sort of follow the laws of physics, and it looks almost human as long as the strigas keep a very tight grip on their emotions, on their as long as they suppress that other heart, as long as they starve it, as they call it. But any stronger emotion, joy, fear, anger, can provoke that other heart to sort of activate, and then the shadow becomes sort of more visible and can move sort of almost of its own volition, can even rise up from the ground. And so any transgression against the rules, which say you must starve your heart, is instantly visible. There's no hiding, your transgressions in the striga community. So obviously they are all. I wanted to keep it ambiguous because there are a lot of sort of possibilities residing within sort of those striga powers, and because they are linked to emotions and sort of human passions, this idea of suppressing them sort of spoke to me very strongly, and in many ways, when strigas do explore their nature, they see that a lot of it is about connection and about understanding the world around them and being linked to the world around them, and stopping that costs them in many ways.
Yeah, very much gave the impression that what you might consider natural human impulses were being considered transgressive, and they were the things being repressed by the people, and therefore sort of collectively oppressed by the societies you built. It was very, very coherent sort of society that flowed from it, and it seemed so well designed to accommodate what I thought was one of your absolutely essential themes, which was how do you raise a child in this in this sort of world, and it runs through it like the DNA of the story, really.
It's I think it's a question that none of the mothers in the book have real answers to. They know what's expected of them, and there's this idea that when the child's born, keep it comfortable so that this other heart doesn't sort of activate before they know they're supposed to suppress its impulses. But the point is, like none of the mothers know what to do in real life, and none of the mothers really know what to do in the story. They're human, and some of them are consumed by the same fear as the human society. Some of them build their whole identity around being the sort of strict strict leaders who kind of make sure that they police all of those rules that were set up in order to stop strigas from discovering the sort of true nature of the other hearts. So I wanted to keep all of that sort of ambiguous and unclear for them, because none of them, even when they knew some of the mothers in that story, when they thought for sure they were making the right choice, that's when they were making the wrong choice. And when they were most unsure, that's when they were truly being guided by their kind of natural instinct, and they were making the right choices, but they were never truly sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that range that you were talking about, how they reacted to them, there's sort of like the rule breakers and the rule keepers, and the people who are a bit more cynical and use the rules to their advantage a bit, and sometimes did absolutely dreadful things with it. That for a large part of the book, that was the engine of what really kept you compelled to examine what was happening in these societies. It was such a readable sort of thread going through all of that, and I found myself getting very wound up by the actions of some of the characters in there. I mean, like, some of them behaved in, it's weird, it was like very coherently, the existence of Striga had meant that this particular, there are two societies in the book. There's the town from which you just heard of Myriad being expelled in the excerpt that you read from, and then there's a Striga sort of settlement. And the way they react to being in this extremely rules-constrained environment, how they use it and sort of react to it, it made such human stories. It was such a wonderful thing to read, and very, very compelling as well. Total page-turning stuff. So I mean, thinking about that, like, one of the ideas that came across from me is that there's a very simplistic sense of justice, both in the town, but especially in the village. And on more than one occasion, the character is completely damned by hearsay. And one of the things that struck me is that when the folklore superstitions are not real, that's one of the things that comes from this. And this one, the folklore superstitions kind of are real. You know, the Striga do exist. So in your view, would this make the taboos as laws understandable, even if they're troubling?
I think the problem isn't the fear itself necessarily. The problem is the orthodoxy that had been built around the unknown. So it's natural to be scared of something that is that different. And I think the sort of cure for that is to truly explore it and to try and understand it, and to try and sort of build a link in a community to allow for this to kind of coexist. And so, you know, fear is a natural human emotion, and I think ridiculing it is not necessarily always the most helpful strategy. You know, in terms of, you know, the wider world, we see every day how fear can be politicized and weaponized in order to hurt people, and I think the allowing for a certain openness and for allowing for people to explore those fears, it would be sort of way forward and would be more understanding. But unfortunately, humans like black and white rules in every society. You know, whatever sort of political affiliation people have, whichever country they're from, people really like black and white rules, and they really like orthodoxy is safety. And when people feel the least safe, when they don't feel loved, when they don't feel accepted, they create a structure around themselves. You know, there's a character in a book, Kalina, who is not the most lovable of characters, and I loved writing her. And, you know, I hope maybe one day I'll be able to sort of explore her story a bit more, because she is a person who sort of fell through the cracks of the village life and of a Striga community. It's a small community, and generally children are taken in by families, but her parents died. She's a side character, but like, her parents died when she was quite young, but she was old enough that people just sort of, nobody really took her in. She was kind of parceled around, you know, everyone fed her, everyone took care of her, and nobody really loved her. And she needed every child and every human needs that structure that makes them feel safe and accepted. And so she built herself a role of a sort of a self-appointed rule keeper, of self-appointed sheriff. And that's not the most lovable role, but it gave her a sense of purpose and like a sense of belonging. And for me, Kalina is really in the sort of at the heart of this issue of how outcasts can sort of find comfort in the same orthodoxy that actually keeps them out as outcasts.
Yeah, she was a really, really interesting character. I mean, it's very easy to start by thinking she was kind of like the net curtain twitching, person who'd dob you in, and then as you learnt about her, she was like a lot of the characters in this. It was odd. You got very close to sympathising with it, and then they'd do something which would sort of like sweep all of that away. So I mean, on the characters, like the central characters are Myriad, who we heard, and Salka, her daughter, who is mentioned in the extract that you read, and I thought this was a really fascinating relationship. There's a very important time jump in the book, which happens very early on, where you've met Myriad as a young woman, and Salka as an infant, and then it jumps to Salka being about that age. And one of the things I found so interesting about this book was showing how sort of like the role of motherhood, with its sort of like protection and sacrifice and all of that, is sort of like is definitely present, but it also has the real influence from one day to the next of how you can, like, the role models that mothers have pass on sort of values and identities to their children. That happens in so many different characters in the book. And I thought with Salka and Myriad, that was very evident. There was a moment where Salka basically behaved in a very noble way because her mother had taught her to do this, but was doing something her mother absolutely wouldn't have wanted her to do by doing it. I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, it's about, sometimes sort of people want to sacrifice, a part of themselves or something dear to them for people they love, and that sacrifice might not be the right thing, but this is, people do interesting things out of love. So but the relationship is, I see both of them as the sort of main character of the book. I think many people tend to navigate to the younger character as the main character, but for me, it's really a story about that mother and a daughter and the different mothers and daughters in that community, and they all make different choices, but they all have agency. And it was really important to me to have a book with older female characters as well, who sort of retain their personhood rather than just sort of putting them in that slow, sort of narrow motherhood box thing that traditionally fantasy doesn't have an awful lot of older female characters. I think as I always read fantasy books, but as I got older, I realized, over the age of 20, there's not actually many female protagonists my age, and and that's even more true, of characters in their 40s and 50s and 60s, and so I have characters from their early 20s up until their 60s, and I really think there's just so much to explore there in terms of motherhood is a very important aspect of some of those characters, but they do have their own agenda, they do have their own personhood, and it's not as difficult to reconcile as some sort of traditional fantasy fiction would lead us to believe. So it's
absolutely. I thought that came across so terrifically. Another character I just name checked because I thought she was so fascinating was Alba, who did both of those and was informed by motherhood, but also was her, like, she is the character of agency for a great deal of what happens in the book, and it feels like such a well-rounded way of being forced to balance those things for her. I thought she and Dran was such an interesting pairing.
It's so Alma is the leader of Strigas. So she's sort of this she's a matriarch, but she's very severe. She's very strict. She has a sort of borderline obsession with being seen as it's really, her reputation is really important to her, and it's really important to her that people see her as, you know, strict but fair and just, and that is sometimes put in conflict with her, one could say, excessive love for her son. So she, you know, she is sort of torn between her duty and what she thinks is the best thing for her son. And it's some of the choices she makes, you know, some of the choices she has to make are kind of juxtaposed against what Myriad has to decide, but their decisions are very different because they come from sort of very different place. So it was important to me to show this contrast that, you know, so Alma is this character who basically, she has to convince herself that she's right. She despises uncertainty. She doesn't like making decisions without being absolutely convinced that she's right, and that's not always possible in the kind of very gray area in which sugars exist as a community.
Yeah, and that's I want to be careful how much I give away, but there's a character who sort of inherits some of those values kind of by accident, and it has enormous consequences in the book, and it's very, very interesting to watch that play out. We've got some questions from people who have been watching. I don't know who they're from, so I'm just going to pick some that as they've come on the list. Did the themes of the novel come before the story, or did the themes develop as you wrote it?
I think, you know, so basically the book starts with, for me, you know, with a big idea I want to explore. So for me, I wanted to explore several things. I wanted to explore the concept of, you know, the choices that a mother has to make if her child's an outcast. That's one thing I wanted to explore. I wanted to explore what kind of a community would those outcasts create, because they come to the mountains with the same set of prejudices and, you know, the same fear that the town folk have, because they're essentially the same people, so they have the same taboos. Perhaps even stronger on the Shiga side, because they see themselves as evil. So they don't. So that's the kind of starting point that I wanted to explore. The parallels and the other themes, they kind of grew from that. Sometimes you only realize that you're creating a parallel within your book or a theme when you're like halfway through it, or during the editorial stage, you might sort of see and think like, oh, I didn't realize that I was touching on that subject, but clearly this was very important to me, so maybe I should emphasize it in the edits. So it's a complex question, because it's not like you start with one or the other. You tend to start with questions that you want to sort of answer for yourself, or not even if answer, just to explore the questions. And the themes sort of grow out of that.
So I think of all the books I've read this year, this is the one which felt like it had the most control of its themes, and it's I like the setting is very compact. It's got a town and a village and the wilderness, and that's exactly as much as it needs. It placed it and used all of it to exactly the right amount. I really, really liked it. Okay, another question. Oh, this one's about that wilderness. The natural setting of the book, the forest and rivers, almost seem like its own character. What inspired such a vivid setting?
So, I mean, a lot of it was inspired by my childhood in Poland. Poland has just absolutely stunning countryside. You know, we have, you know, there's the seaside, there's we have our own lake district that I would go to every summer with my grandparents and my parents, and and the tranquil lakes and the forests really influenced the way I see nature. My grandfather was a hunter, so hunters in Poland, it's sort of like its own thing. So I would go with him to sort of build sort of feeding. Well, I was a little kid, so my helping was not very effective, but like to help him build like feeding stations for deer in winter time. He would sort of teach me how to track animals in the forest, and that was and that was a very sort of important sort of formative experience for me in terms of how I perceive nature. And I like to write nature, that is beautiful, but without this kind of pastoral sentimentality that you can sometimes see. It's so
to achieve that.
So Strigas live in an absolutely gorgeous place. They live in those high sort of alpine style mountains. There's a pine forest that surrounds them, and they are aware of the beauty of the place they live in. But they're also aware of the realities of it. They're aware that there's a lot of danger, there's a lot of hardship, and there's a lot of day-to-day tasks that you have to do that are not very glamorous, but keep you alive.
Yeah, well, the sense of living in a nearly destitute sense of the land, that came across very strongly. There's also a terrific scene, which is incredibly tense, where one of the protagonists is being chased by an aggressor through the wildlife. It's absolutely riveting now. But it also made me wonder if one of the ideas you have for the Striga which sort of come into their own when they're in the wilderness, and to some extent, was that suggesting that there was some natural connection to nature which humans have, which is repressed in an urban setting?
It's a great question. It's not something I thought about extensively. I could, it's such a good question. I could probably write an article about it and make it up. The point is, it's I wanted to create a setting that felt both large in scale, and in order to contrast it with this slightly claustrophobic feeling of the village life and the town life. So, to answer your question, it's not something that was on my mind in terms of, that we repress it as sort of in urban living. But I think it goes without saying that we do. It's not. I think this idea that the repression of the natural instincts, it's a very common one in many cultures. This idea that you have to behave according to the rules rather than behaving according to your nature. Even within the bounds of like not hurting anybody, I'm not talking about just completely anarchist sort of situation. This is this idea that you have to really repress your feelings and repress what you want to do, sort of limit yourself in that way. So I thought it would be really interesting to contrast that with those sweeping sort of views of the mountains.
Yeah, that really came across. It was terrific. Okay, another question from the gallery. When researching Striga and the folklore around them, did you come across any other memorable myths and pieces of lore that you would have liked to include?
A lot, but I wanted to keep it quite tight because I was focused on exploring the sort of the very human kind of communities and the societal issues that sprung from those. I mean, it's a small book. It's a self-contained book. It's not a series. It's not a series. Yeah. So there are certain elements of folklore. I wanted to preserve what I see as the main sort of atmosphere of Slavic folklore, which is that threat is everywhere. So obviously the idea that everything around you is in some way out to get you, that you have monsters living in the lakes, in the forest, in the very air you breathe, and that you have to be aware of those risks and kind of, occasionally perform certain, ritualistic kind of actions in order to protect yourself. That's something that really appeals to me, and I wanted to kind of infuse the book with that, but I wanted to really keep it tight on like a couple of actual folkloric elements in order to explore them more fully, because otherwise, you could create, you could bring in all those creatures, but I think it would detract from the main sort of theme of the book.
Well, as a reader, I absolutely agree. One of the things I really liked about it was it took this idea and it showed its sort of influence and its extrapolation and produced in this perfectly formed story. And in case anyone's wondering, it's we've made it sound as if it's entirely about the internal machinations of these societies, and to a huge extent it is. But there comes a point in the book where an event happens which caused them all to very dramatically reevaluate what has happened. It's a huge fantasy scale event. It is a proper full-on fantasy book. Right, I've got some questions now which are much more about you. What is your writing space like? Do you have a particular place you write at a particular time, or is it whenever?
I do. It's quite messy right now. I can even show it to you.
Oh, yes, please. Wow. I
have a desk right here. I painted it beautifully myself, and then my children decided to unpaint it. But during lockdown, I like to switch it up and kind of, write in my chair, right on the floor. It does get a bit boring sometimes. I sort of in normal times, I really like writing outside, and I like the kind of ambience of people just like walking around and chatting in cafes. It's very nice.
And that sort of hubbub works for you, that sort of gentle noise of people talking.
Yeah, I do like that. I do like sort of, it feels like you're sort of a part of it a little bit. And I always have, I really like writing with my friends. So we, at the moment, over last year or so, I have two really good writing buddies, and one of them I've seen pretty much every day. We just go on Zoom. We have a Zoom meeting, and I sort of minimize the screen, have her in the corner of my screen, sort of hovering, and I write my thing, she writes her thing. But it keeps you accountable. It feels like, and I think there's a lot of people doing something similar. There's now apps that create sort of office ambience, where you get like people just chattering in the background, like, mugs sort of knocking against each other. So
different times of the day as well. You've got coffee shops in the morning, coffee shops in mid-afternoon.
Yes, exactly. So I'm not alone in that.
Okay, so I think you probably knew a question a bit like this was going to come up. You're a debut author. How did you enjoy the experience of being published for the first time, and the process of going through edits and the cover designs and all that sort of thing?
Oh gosh, I mean, I had a fantastic experience, actually. I have an agent that I really click with, and I really respect his input. So John Baker, he is very insightful in the sort of on the editorial stage, and he really helped me to make the book better. And then at Angry Robot, with my editor Eleanor Tuesday, she was just really helpful. There was nothing. I would struggle, I think, with something very kind of top down, like, oh, you have to change it in this exact way. But all of it was conversation. They were not skimping on my time, and it was a wonderful experience. And I didn't expect it to be this good, quite frankly. So I'm just really happy, and people by and large have been quite kind in the reviews as well. So I'm very
rightly so.
Very grateful.
Accurate. They've been accurate.
I like that. I like that. Let's go with accurate.
Hey, what I think you've spoken about this elsewhere. You're writing in what's for your second language, and I think you've mentioned that you see that as, and I think it's fair to say that you use this as a strength. What's your approach to this?
So it's a sort of multi-layered question. I wrote a whole article about it.
I know.
It's a question that I would have been quite sensitive about actually some years ago, because I think you sort of worry that you won't live up to people's expectations, and but I've lived here for so many years that English is my main language. I can't, I'm not. I have lived my entire adult life in the UK. My cadence, my syntax will always be slightly different to someone who was born here, and but I don't. I do see it as a strength. I remember I went to an event with Salman Rushdie once, and he was talking about how when you're multilingual, you often import the melody of your mother tongue onto the way you write in your adopted language. And that creates a flavor that is uniquely yours. And there's something to be said for that.
I think I recognize that. Had some very lyrical phrases. It had, and I think I can see what you mean about the cadence. You also, there's one sentence that you used which expressed something that I've thought for quite a while incredibly well, and I wish I'd written it down so I could quote it back to you. It was where you mentioned that people who get up early think that they're virtuous, whereas in fact they simply have an advantage over everybody else. I thought.
Oh yeah, it's something actually my my husband found quite funny. He is not an early riser, whereas my family is. And I think I used to see natural inclination as virtue. And I think re-examining things like that is often helpful in actually understanding each other, because so
right. Okay. Well, I think we're probably heading up to time to wrap up now. I'm just going to check to see if there's any questions I missed. I think we've got. I think we've covered everything that I've seen. I've got a last question for you then. You're a debut author. Your new terrific book out today. You've also, I think, you've got a recently started video series about what it's like to be a new writer. Tell us about that.
So I started a YouTube channel called Bookish Take with another debut author, Caroline Hardacre. She has a novel coming out from Angry Robot called Composite Creatures. It's coming out next month, and we just thought it would be so fun to actually talk about our experiences in this. Like, this is our take on it, So because even though we both write roughly within the same genre, we are interested in similar themes. Our experiences are so different, and every single writer I have spoken to has a different approach to writing, to drafting, to editing, and exploring those differences, I think, can be really helpful to people who think that. I think many writers starting out think that there's just one way of doing things, and I think that it's more about finding your way, something that suits you. And so it's kind of like a mini series where we go week by week. We go from like that first initial idea, sort of drafting the first draft, editorial stage, approaching agents, beta readers, things like that. So we do it kind of thematically.
How handy.
Tips.
Exactly, sort of questions which come up a lot. That's terrific. Sorry, that's a bit of a digression. Congratulations on your new book. It's absolutely terrific. I genuinely loved it. I really, honestly recommend it. I think people absolutely should seek it out. What have you got coming next?
That sort of depends on Angry Robot. I mean, well, actually, the first thing it depends on is the sales. So, buy my book. Basically, depending on how well you do, that's when I have another book that is written. I have another sort of pitch and idea that I have written. But it very much depends on what the feeling is in terms of, do people want more of the same thing? Do they want something different? It's so, I have a few books sort of either finished or in the works. Something sort of for sort of middle grade as well. Right. So the answer is we'll see. Nothing's set in stone.
Beginning of a big journey.
I hope so. I do have big plans.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming to join us. The second bell is launched today. It's available, I would say everywhere, but given the circumstances, all the places which you might hope to find a book. Please do support authors, and please, when they're open, support bookshops. This video is going up on SRFC's YouTube channel, where you can already find more than 100 readings and interviews, some of which are by the incredibly insightful Caroline Mersey. A big thank you to Angry Robot for hosting this evening. If it's gone technically well, then that's all due to them. Not only did they give us the author, but they also gave us all of the technology to make it happen. And a huge thank you to Gabriela Houston for coming to speak to us, and also for writing such a fabulous book. It's absolutely terrific. And finally, a thank you to you. See you soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.